Is science fiction solely a 20th century phenomena? I had one of my viewers suggest that it was a 20th century literature and that it is going away now. I've also heard people talk about slipstream literature, that is, literature that is science fiction but doesn't claim to be science fiction. In fact, distances themselves away from science fiction. Recently, I was at a book launch for the downloaded Ghost in the Machine by Robert J. Sawyer, a very proud science fiction author. In fact, his website is sfwriter.com. Here's what he had to say about this subject. It's couched in terms of two stories, one about Margaret Atwood and the second about Kurt Vonnegut. Take a listen and I'll talk about it on the other side.
Toronto Public Library is, by number of branches, the largest public library system in the world. It has more branches than New York Public Library. It's 100 branches. And they don't do it anymore, but they used to give an award every year called the Toronto Public Library Celebrates Reading Award, given to the writer whose work, in the judgment of their Blue Ribbon panel, had given the most joy to patrons of the library in the preceding year. And the shtick of that award was that the previous year's laureate had to give it to the next year's laureate. Well, of course, Margaret Atwood, quite deservedly, won the award one year. And the award presentation was at a big fundraiser they used to do for the Toronto Public Library called the Book Lovers Ball, black tie fundraiser. They would have tables. Every table would have one big name Canadian author seated at a table, and often corporations would buy the rest of the table, and but individuals would pay $150 to eat, at the Royal York banquet thing, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, so Margaret had won it one year. I was the winner the following year. And Margaret, in her presenting it to me, because as you said, Margaret is famous for disclaiming that she's part of my tribe. And so she said, and I just want to say how happy I am to see this going to a science fiction writer. And I said, Margaret, I just want to say how happy I am to be getting it from a science fiction writer. Brought the house down. So I have no complaint about writers whose work is not marketed as science fiction. There's a glass ceiling, or a dilithium ceiling, or a xenonite ceiling. There's a ceiling of how high your sales can go if you're in a category section of the bookstore. And the science fiction section, you can make national bestsellers lists, I certainly have. But in the mainstream section, you're going to sell a lot more. And Jack McClellan, who was Margaret's publisher for The Handmaid's Tale, you can find a clip on YouTube of Jack and Margaret having a conversation, maybe at the Harbour Festival of Authors, I can't remember where. And they were talking about the plans for her forthcoming book, now 40 years old, 41 now, The Handmaid's Tale. And Jack McClellan, the publisher of McClellan Stewart, the Canadian publisher until it was bought by the Americans, said, but of course we're not going to call it science fiction. And Margaret said, of course not. And that's perfectly fine because they knew it would sell in enormous numbers to people who didn't know that they liked science fiction, and even after they read it, didn't know that they liked science fiction, no matter how much they loved The Handmaid's Tale. I don't object to anybody finding the best way to find the largest audience for their books. And I gave Margaret a free pass, and still she started saying things like, science fiction is just talking squids in space. My friend Ted Chiang, who wrote The Story of Your Life, which was the basis for the film Arrival, I keep meaning to ask him when I see him, and I see him about once a year, if he wrote his talking squids from space in that film Arrival, the story it's based on, as a direct rebuttal to Margaret. But as long as you don't diss science fiction, I don't mind you trying to distance yourself from science fiction if it's going to get you better sales. I'm past president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, and we have kind of a discussion every year about who we might give our highest honor to, which is Damon Knight, who's our founder. People, who's Damon Knight? Anybody watch Twilight Zone knows the episode To Serve Man, and the punchline that the book that the aliens have brought, no, we're here to serve man. It's a cookbook. That's Damon Knight's famous story. Damon founded the Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America, so our highest honor is the Damon Knight Memorial Grand Massacre Award. And, maybe 20 years ago, the then current president said, you know who's an obvious oversight in our pantheon of recipients of the Grand Master? Kurt Vonnegut. And, Vonnegut. Well, let's give it to Vonnegut. And a wise head prevailed. I think it was Robert Silverberg. Why don't we ask him if he will graciously receive it rather than bestow it upon him and maybe have him reject it? And so the president called up Vonnegut and said, and Vonnegut, as it was relayed to us, the other past presidents, he said, you know I'm a science fiction writer. I know I'm a science fiction writer. But the critics use science fiction, the critics use the drawer labeled science fiction as a urinal. And I don't want to be pissed upon. So thank you, but no thanks. And it is true, it used to be very common for people who had never read or never widely read in science fiction to think they had expert opinions on it because they had seen Star Wars. And yet you will not find anybody say, I know all about mystery fiction. I watched Murder, She Wrote. Right? Nobody feels that way. But everybody feels, I've seen Star Wars, I understand what it's all about. Oh, it's also A Handmaid's Tale. It's also 1984. It's also Brave New World. It's also H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, the first science fiction novel ever written by a woman, Mary Shelley, 1818. It's the Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. It's this whole wide panoply of things that are thought experiments that are either unethical, impractical, or impossible to conduct in the real world that are worth conducting because they say something illuminating about the human condition. That's what science fiction is. But a lot of people, a lot of critics think no. And so I can understand why Kurt and Margaret didn't want to be labeled as that, but that's the answer to your question.
A couple quotes worth repeating here. The first one, as long as you don't diss science fiction, I don't mind if you distance yourself from science fiction. It seems like genre doesn't even matter if it's science fiction or fantasy. It could be mystery or other ones. They have particular spots in a bookstore. But the main line of fiction is a wide capacity, best-selling area of that bookstore. Reaches more people. People who aren't looking to narrow themselves into a genre. No wonder people don't want to be confined to that glass ceiling of a genre. So in that way, I sometimes wonder, is the classification, the genre classification actually dying out? Was my viewer right that it was really a 20th century phenomena, and now science fiction has gone mainstream? Science fiction now is the literature of the general public, something that we don't want to distinguish in a separate bookshelf in the back of the bookstore. I can understand that. The second comment that I want to highlight here, or quote from the video, was that science fiction is thought experiments that say something illuminating about the human condition. I've often thought of science fiction as that genre which includes all other genres. You can have mysteries in here, but I also thought about it as in the sciences. There's what you might call the hard sciences, but there's also the soft sciences which are included here, the very speculative end of things. But what is it about an extrapolation that can tell us more about the human condition itself? Perhaps our wrestling with technology and science is part of that human condition, which is so important to this 21st century. We live in what was science fiction. How is that playing out? How will that play out in the future? I think there's still a lot more science fiction to be had in this 21st century. I don't know if you'll find it on a science fiction bookshelf. I'm curious, do you have some thoughts about what you've heard here? Is science fiction dead? Or has it gone mainstream? I'm curious to hear what you think. Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep reading.